Jacob put away his cell phone. After a moment of consideration, he decided to go in and have a look. Sophie hadn't said anything, but he had a pretty good idea why she was still here. The school gate was now open. Jacob walked into the campus and mingled in with the exiting crowd. In fact, the old gatekeeper had noticed Jacob, but he let him in since Jacob was the prince of the clan, and the school had ended for the day. Jacob entered the school and walked against the flow of students toward the building where Sophie's class from last time was. The building was now empty. Jacob went to Sophie's classroom. Through the glass window on the door, he saw Sophie sitting there alone, tapping away on her phone. Jacob pushed the door open and entered. Sophie abruptly straightened up, probably thinking that it was a teacher, and her gaze turned to the door. "Oh, you came in after all." "Well, I wasn't going to wait for you to finish your detention," Jacob mumbled and walked in. "Hey, wasn't even my fault this time," Sophie pouted. "Sure." Jacob closed the classroom door and rolled his eyes. He was pretty familiar with Sophie's affinity for causing mischief. "It really wasn't. I feel like taking a nap." Sophie covered a yawn behind her hand. "Isn't a teacher supposed to be here, though?" Jacob asked again. "Apparently, Miss Blue has better things to do than watching a nuisance like me." "Her words, not mine," Sophie said and rolled her eyes. She hated Miss Blue with all her might. Jacob nodded with sympathy. He had only met the class advisor a couple of times, but he definitely wasn't especially fond of her either. After a few minutes of sitting in silence, Jacob couldn't help but finally ask, "What did you do, though?" Sophie's cheeks immediately pinked at the question, and she started staring at the ground as if it would open up and swallow her. I might have emptied my bottle of water on someone's head during the class," she answered sheepishly. "What? Why?" Jacob almost yelled, trying very hard to not burst into a fit of laughter. "Well, it really wasn't my fault. That guy was getting on my nerves. He was sitting behind me, and during the English class, he wouldn't stop kicking the back of my seat. Now, I did ask him to stop nicely and tried to concentrate on the class, but he just wouldn't stop. He was being very annoying, so..." She trailed off. Oh my God. Jacob couldn't hold it in anymore and started laughing loudly. He almost fell over the chair while holding his stomach. Sophie stared at him with an unamused expression. "Are you quite done?" Jacob couldn't even stop laughing for long enough to answer her. Finally, having enough of being laughed at, Sophie stood up and started hitting Jacob's bicep with her hands. Stop laughing, otherwise I'll dump water on your head as well," she shouted at him. Jacob stood up as well, trying to save himself from her hits. Even though she wasn't really hurting him, Sophie joined him eventually, laughing at herself, realizing how she had stupidly landed herself into her current predicament. They both calmed down after a few minutes when they finally needed to catch a breath after the non-stop laughing. As they both sat back down, Sophie's eyes fell on her phone, and she realized that Miss Blue would be there any minute to relieve her from the detention. She immediately went into panic mode as she knew if her class advisor saw Jacob in the classroom with her, she would definitely call her parents. Her parents were already mad at her from last night. This would probably be their last straw. "Oh my God, I completely forgot about the time. My counselor will be here any minute. You need to hide," she exclaimed with panic. "What? Where will I hide now? There's not even a cupboard in this classroom." Jacob looked around frantically as well. "You can hide in the janitor's closet. It's just the next door." Sophie suddenly remembered and got on her feet to push him out. Jacob wanted to protest, but just then his heightened hearing picked up the crisp sound of heels clicking on the marble floor. The sound was coming from downstairs and was getting louder every second. So without saying anything, he let Sophie push him outside the class and into the small janitor's closet. It was cramped up space filled with cleaning supplies and hardly any space for a full-grown adult to hide inside. Jacob made sure to maintain a pin-drop silence from his end and pressed his ear against the door to listen outside. They had realized their mistake quite early and been able to give Sophie enough time to settle back down on her desk and pull out her math homework in an attempt to look busy. When Miss Blue actually made it inside the class, she was surprised to find Sophie studying, instead of being fast asleep as she had expected. Though she didn't let the surprise show on her face, put on a hard expression and said, "You can leave now, but if something like this happens again, I'll make sure to take you to the principal and call your parents." Sophie packed up her stuff with her head lowered, trying to look as guilty as possible. When she finally stepped outside the door, she looked at the next door for a moment, but under the teacher's watchful eyes, she immediately headed towards the exit stairs. Once she was out of sight, Miss Blue closed the class door and went in the opposite direction. where her office was located. As soon as Jacob heard the clicks of her office door, he jumped out of the janitor's closet as quietly as he could, and then took off towards the stairs, where Sophie was waiting for him with a nervous expression. She relaxed when she saw him and immediately held his hand, running towards the main gates of the school, not wanting to linger around any longer, risk getting caught. They hurriedly walked out of the school and took a bus back to Sophie's home. On the bus, once they had caught their breaths, Jacob asked her incredulously, "If you knew you would get into trouble, then why did you call me inside?" "But we didn't get into trouble, and that's all that matters," Sophie said instead of answering, resting her head on his shoulder. When they got home, Helen was setting up the dinner table, and she was surprised to see that Jacob had returned with Sophie. She thought Jacob wouldn't come today after the previous day's incident. After all, Draken said that the North Atlantic Dragon Clan might cut Jacob off, which was indeed an awkward topic. "Dad, Mom!" Sophie pulled Jacob into the room and called out cheerfully. "Hi," Jacob greeted them hesitantly. Draken put down the newspaper and nodded before walking to the dinner table. He also thought that Jacob wouldn't come today. However, to his surprise, Jacob came back with Sophie. Obviously, he had picked Sophie up from school. "Jacob, please sit down," Helen gestured at the seat Jacob usually sat in and placed the bowls and spoons on the table. "Soph will have finals soon, so can I come to tutor her?" Jacob explained when he took his seat. "Thank you, that's very nice," Helen said, trying to smooth things over. "Let's eat," Draken picked up his spoon and said, effectively cutting off any further conversation. No one mentioned the unpleasant topic from yesterday. However, Draken's expression was still frighteningly dark. In the last couple of days, the South Atlantic Dragon Clan had been doing well by drawing other forces to its side, playing the card of the victim. The gifts the North Atlantic Dragon Clan sent to the East and the West Atlantic Dragon Clan were turned back, and the businesses on land were impacted severely as well. The West and East Atlantic Dragon Clan both had businesses on land that had partnerships with the MTX group. Now, these projects were either stopped or postponed, and a venture that had been agreed upon 1 month ago was put on hold as well. "Dad, I've made a decision," Sophie broke the silence at the dinner table. She paused for 2 seconds and looked at Draken before continuing. "If you decide to go through with severing all ties with Jacob, then I plan to sever ties with you guys and move to Jacob's home."